When my son told me I wasn't welcome for Christmas, I smiled and went home. 2 days later, I checked my phone. That single moment is carved into my heart forever. I had carried gifts in a small bag, a tin of cookies I baked just like I used to when he was little. I walked up his porch, ready to knock, but before my hand could even touch the door, he stepped out. His eyes were cold, his tone even colder. "Mom, it's better if you don't come this year. We need space." I stood there frozen, holding my cookies like a fool. Behind him, I could hear the faint laughter of his wife and her relatives. My daughter-in-law's shadow moved across the living room, and I knew this wasn't my son's idea. But he was the one speaking the words, and that hurt the most. My throat tightened, yet I forced a smile. I didn't beg, I didn't argue. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked down those steps with every ounce of dignity I had left. The winter air bit at my face, but the chill inside my chest was worse. Christmas, the one time of year meant for family, and I was left standing alone on the sidewalk. I carried my bag back home, the cookies untouched, my footsteps echoing on the icy street. I sat in my quiet house, the lights from my small tree twinkling in the corner, mocking me with their cheer. I wanted to cry, but I refused to give them that power, even in my solitude. 2 days later, when the world was still glowing with festive warmth, I picked up my phone. My screen lit up with a shocking sight. 19 missed calls. The sight of those 19 missed calls stayed in my mind like a flashing red warning light. But before I tell you what happened after I saw them, I need to explain how everything reached this point. Because the truth is, being rejected for Christmas was not an isolated event. It was the result of months, no, years of quiet tension that had been simmering inside my family ever since my husband passed away. When my husband was alive, our family gatherings were lively and warm. He was a man who loved traditions, especially Christmas. He insisted that we eat dinner together, exchange small but thoughtful gifts, and sing carols after dessert. Even when our son married and brought his new wife into the family, those traditions continued for a while. But after my husband's death, the balance shifted. My daughter-in-law began to take control of decisions, and slowly, I felt my place in the family shrinking. At first it was subtle. She would host dinners at their house and forget to mention it to me until the last minute. She would roll her eyes when I shared stories about my husband, as though his memory was a burden to her. My son, caught between his wife and me, often chose silence. That silence cut deeper than any harsh word. The subject of the house and money crept in more often than I wanted to admit. My daughter-in-law had a way of dropping hints, usually in front of my son. "This house is so big for one person," she'd say with a sweet smile that barely hid her intentions. Or, "Property values are up. Imagine what we could do if we sold and bought something better suited for us." She always said "we," as though my life and my home were already part of her possessions. I would pretend not to notice, but inside, I did. I noticed every word. My son never pushed directly, but I could feel his unease. He had debts. I knew that much. He worked long hours, and there were whispered arguments between him and his wife about finances. I kept my distance, not wanting to intrude, but the unspoken pressure was there. They wanted something from me, something more than cookies and warm smiles. They wanted control of what my husband and I built together: our home, our savings, our security. The final months leading to Christmas were especially tense. My daughter-in-law started questioning why I still lived in the family house alone. She suggested not once but several times that I should consider moving into a retirement community. "You'd have company there," she said, feigning concern. "It's not safe for you to stay by yourself in that big old place." But I saw through her words. She didn't care about my safety. She cared about the deed to the house. I brushed it off politely, but deep down I felt the storm gathering. Every holiday season, I used to be the one to decorate the tree with my son. But that year, he didn't call me to help. I drove past his house one evening and saw the lights already strung up, glowing bright and merry. My stomach twisted. They hadn't even asked me to join. When he finally called a week before Christmas, I thought it was to invite me over, to reassure me I still had a place at the table. But instead, it was a brief, awkward conversation. He mentioned they would be hosting Christmas Eve at their house, with her relatives and some friends. He sounded hesitant, and then his tone grew firmer. "Mom, maybe this year. It's best if you take it easy at home. We'll come see you after the holidays." Insects. I remember holding the phone in silence, my heart sinking. He must have felt the weight of what he said, because he quickly added, "It's just, with all the people and the space, it might be too much." But I heard the truth in his voice. It wasn't about space. It was about me not fitting into their perfect little picture. So when I showed up at his porch with my tin of cookies, I was clinging to hope. Hope that maybe he didn't mean it. That maybe once he saw me there, he would open the door wide and let me in. But instead, I was met with rejection, sharp and undeniable. I went home that night feeling stripped of my dignity. The loneliness was unbearable. I decorated my own small tree, cooked a simple meal, and sat by myself while families across the neighborhood laughed and celebrated. Every carol on the radio reminded me of the years gone by, the warmth I once had, and the emptiness I now faced. I tried to comfort myself by remembering that I still had what my husband left me. He had been careful, meticulous with finances. The house was mine alone, not joint property with my son. There were savings tucked away that my daughter-in-law knew nothing about. I had never flaunted it, never used it as a weapon, but I knew, one day, it might become the only shield I had left. And so, when I saw those 19 missed calls blinking on my phone 2 days after Christmas, I didn't panic. I didn't rush to call back. Instead, I sat down slowly, let the phone rest in my palm, and thought about all those subtle insults, the cold shoulders, the not-so-innocent hints about selling the house. Something had shifted. I didn't know the full story yet, but I knew with certainty those calls were not about love or guilt. They were about desperation. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of control return to me. The day of Christmas came, and though I tried to keep my spirits steady, the silence in my house felt heavier than ever before. I had never spent a Christmas alone in all my life. Even in the lean years when my husband and I could barely afford presents, we had each other and our son. Now the tree in my living room blinked cheerfully, but its glow seemed to mock me more than comfort me. That morning, I pulled out the little box of ornaments my husband used to love. I hung a few on the tree, more out of habit than joy. The glass star he once lifted my son up to place on the highest branch sat in my hand, and I could almost hear his laughter. I didn't put it up this year. Somehow, it felt wrong, as though placing it there would only remind me of everything I had lost. I tried to busy myself in the kitchen. I baked another batch of cookies, not because anyone would eat them, but because the smell of cinnamon and sugar reminded me of better days. I made myself a small dinner, roasted chicken with potatoes, the kind of meal I would have shared with my family if I had been welcomed. As I sat down at the table with just one plate, I closed my eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer for strength. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the porch. Across the street, I could see the neighbor's house lit up, cars parked along the curb, and music spilling out every time the door opened. Laughter drifted through the cold air. Families were together, celebrating, while I stood there in my coat, hugging myself against the chill. The loneliness pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. My phone buzzed once that night. A single message from my son. "Hope you're okay, Mom. We'll talk soon." I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. A hollow comfort, those words were. It wasn't the same as a chair at the table, or a hug, or even a plate set out for me. It was the bare minimum, a crumb of affection when I used to be given the whole loaf. I didn't reply. I didn't trust myself not to cry if I did. Instead, I turned off the phone, placed it on the nightstand, and went to bed early. The muffled sound of fireworks cracked in the distance, reminding me that the world was still celebrating, even if I wasn't. The next morning, I tried to shake off the heaviness. I swept the kitchen floor, watered the little poinsettia plant by the window, and folded laundry. But every movement felt mechanical, as if I were just filling time. The silence in the house was deafening. At moments, I found myself whispering to my late husband, as though he were still sitting in his favorite chair. "You wouldn't believe what they've done," I murmured, staring at his framed photograph. "You wouldn't believe how she looks at me, how he listens to her instead of his own mother." By the second day after Christmas, I resolved to stay busy. I took a walk around the neighborhood, bundled up in my thick coat. Children zipped past me on sleds, their laughter echoing across the snow. I nodded at a few neighbors who waved politely, but no one stopped to chat. They all had places to go, people waiting inside. I had only my empty house. When I returned, I made tea and curled up in my armchair with a blanket. That's when I finally turned my phone back on. I expected maybe a message or two, but what I saw startled me. 19 missed calls, all from my son. 19. My thumb hovered over the screen as I scrolled, noting the times. Some in the middle of the night, some early that morning. The urgency in the repeated calls was undeniable. For a moment, I wondered if something terrible had happened. My heart raced, torn between worry and suspicion. But then, another thought struck me. What could possibly drive them to call me 19 times, after turning me away so coldly? Love didn't return that quickly. No, there had to be another reason. Something pressing. Something they needed from me. I placed the phone down and didn't call back. Instead, I sat in silence, staring at the blinking notification as though it were a puzzle to solve. Slowly, I felt the shift inside me. The loneliness of Christmas Eve had cut me deep, but now there was something else blooming. A quiet, powerful certainty. For the first time in days, I wasn't the one on the outside looking in. They were. The realization was strangely comforting. I could feel a flicker of control returning to me, like a small flame in the darkness. I didn't know the full story yet, but I knew I wasn't going to answer right away. If they wanted me, they would wait. So I leaned back in my chair, took a sip of my cooling tea, and let the phone buzz once more on the table. The phone buzzed again that afternoon, and I let it ring until it stopped. By then, I wasn't confused anymore. 19 missed calls told me enough. Something had happened that forced them to swallow their pride and reach for me. What I didn't know yet was exactly what it was. Later that evening, my sister-in-law, Clara, dropped by. She lived 2 towns over but had heard whispers from a mutual friend. She stepped inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and placed her gloves on my table. "You haven't been answering your phone, have you?" she asked carefully. I shook my head. "Why would I?" She exhaled, almost as though she had expected that answer. "They're in trouble. Big trouble. I heard from one of their friends at church. They tried to refinance their house. Turns out, your son thought he had rights over this place too. He and his wife were counting on selling it or using it as collateral. But when the bank checked, the deed was in your name only. He couldn't touch it without you." The words sank into me slowly, but when they settled, they explained everything. Of course. The house. The very same house my husband and I had poured decades of love and sweat into. The same one my daughter-in-law had been circling like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to swoop in. And now they had found out the truth. I held the only key. Clara leaned closer. "They need you to sign something. That's why they've been calling." I laughed softly, though it wasn't with amusement. 19 times, I said, shaking my head. 19 times since Christmas. "They must be desperate," Clara murmured. I nodded, sipping my tea. For a long moment, I stared out the window where snow was beginning to fall again, flakes swirling in the streetlight glow. Desperate. That was exactly what they were. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt no desperation myself. I felt calm, steady. I had all the power they had tried to strip away from me. Over the next day, the calls kept coming. Sometimes it was my son, his voice tight, leaving messages. "Mom, please. Just call me back. We need to talk." Other times it was my daughter-in-law, her tone sharper. "This is serious. You can't ignore us forever. We need to figure this out now." I ignored them all. When I finally did answer, it was 2 evenings later. I picked up on the 20th call, and silence fell on the line before my son's shaky voice spoke. "Mom, thank God. I didn't think you'd ever answer." I didn't respond right away. I let the weight of my silence settle before I said, "I saw your calls." "Yeah," he said quickly. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. We should have invited you. We were wrong, but we really need to talk about the house. About the paperwork. We can't move forward unless you—" There it was, the real reason. Not my presence. Not my feelings. Not my loneliness on Christmas Eve. It was about the house. I cut him off. I know exactly what you need. And I also know why you turned me away at Christmas. You wanted me gone so you could claim what was never yours to begin with. His voice broke. No, Mom, it's not like that. Please let me explain. Behind him, I could hear his wife's muffled voice, urging him to say more, to push harder. It was almost comical, hearing her feed him lines like a director whispering to an actor. You don't need to explain, I said firmly. Your father and I worked our whole lives for this home. He put it in my name because he trusted me, and I won't dishonor that trust by handing it over to someone who can't even offer me a chair at the Christmas table. There was silence. For a moment, I thought he had hung up, but then his voice cracked again. We're drowning, Mom. We have debts. We thought— I know what you thought, I interrupted. You thought I was weak. You thought I'd be grateful for scraps of kindness and give you everything. But you underestimated me. I hung up before he could reply. My hand shook a little, but not from fear. From release. For once, I had spoken the truth without apology. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. In the days that followed, they showed up at my door. They rang the bell, knocked until their knuckles must have ached. Once, I peeked out the curtain and saw my daughter-in-law pacing on the porch, her face tight with frustration. I didn't open the door. Instead, I let them taste the sting of being left outside, unwelcome. Every buzz of my phone, every knock at the door was a reminder. The power had shifted. The woman they had dismissed was the one they now needed. And I wasn't going to make it easy. The following week was unlike any I had ever lived through. For years, I had been the one on the outside, knocking, waiting for permission to enter. Now, the tables had turned, and it was they who hovered outside my door, desperate to be let in. I never imagined I would see my daughter-in-law, so proud and so dismissive, pacing like a restless cat on my porch, peering through my windows as if her sheer will could pull me out. It began with polite attempts. My son called in the morning, his voice carefully softened, as though he thought gentleness would disarm me. Mom, I just want to come by and talk, he said. Please. It's important. I listened, holding the phone against my ear, but when he finished, I hung up without a word. I wasn't cruel. I was simply finished being taken for granted. By the second day, the tone changed. My daughter-in-law's messages were sharper. We can't wait forever, she said in one voicemail. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I replayed that message twice, letting her words settle. Harder for who? For her. Not for me. I was fine. I had a warm house, my savings, and the memory of a husband who once promised I'd never be left unprotected. I was comfortable in my solitude. They, however, were unraveling. On the third evening, I heard a knock at the door. Not a timid tap, but a persistent rapping that echoed through the hall. I walked slowly to the window, moved the curtain just enough to peek out, and saw them both standing there. My son's hands were shoved into his pockets, his shoulders hunched with cold and shame. My daughter-in-law stood stiff beside him, her lips pursed tight. Her eyes darted toward the window, and I knew she saw me. I let the curtain fall back and walked away. The knocking continued for another 5 minutes before silence returned. For the first time in years, I felt no pang of guilt, no urge to cave. Instead, a calm strength rose inside me. This was not vengeance for the sake of cruelty. This was balance being restored. They had chosen to humiliate me at Christmas. They had shown me where I stood in their eyes. Unnecessary, disposable. Now, they were learning that I was neither. Each day brought new attempts. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly called, saying, "Your son's been trying to reach you. Maybe hear him out?" I smiled at the irony. When I needed family, no one spoke up. Now, because there was money on the line, suddenly I was the center of everyone's concern. I told her politely that I would handle things in my own time. By the weekend, desperation had stripped away their pride. My son left a note under my door. The handwriting was shaky, words scrawled as though written in haste. "Mom, please. We're in a bad place. We took out loans expecting we could sell the house. We're drowning. Please, we need you." I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in my desk drawer. I didn't throw it away. I wanted to remember how low they had come. That night, I sat in the living room and thought about the countless times I had bitten my tongue. I remembered sitting at their dinner table, my daughter-in-law making sly remarks about old traditions or how modern families did things differently. I had smiled through it all, trying not to rock the boat. I remembered offering to babysit my grandson, only to be told they already had plans, as though my presence was an inconvenience. Each memory stacked on top of the other until I felt the weight of years pressing against me. And then I remembered my husband's will, the way he had looked at me across the lawyer's desk and said, "I want you to have security, no matter what." He had seen the strength in me long before I saw it myself. So when the phone rang again the next morning, I finally answered. My son's relief was immediate. "Mom, thank you. I've been so worried." His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, I saw the little boy he once was, clutching my hand when he was frightened. My heart softened slightly, but I didn't let it show in my tone. "I've heard your messages," I said calmly. He hesitated. "Then you know how serious this is. We need your help. If we don't get it, we could lose everything." I let silence stretch between us. "You should have thought of that before you told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas." "Mom, that was a mistake," he stammered. "We didn't mean it like that." I closed my eyes, picturing the way his wife had looked at me that night, the smug tilt of her head, the satisfaction in her eyes as my own son turned me away. "No," I said. "You meant it. And now you're realizing the cost." Behind him, I heard muffled arguments, his wife hissing something I couldn't make out. He tried again. "Please, we'll do whatever you want. Just don't leave us hanging." "Whatever I want," I repeated slowly. "Then here's what I want. Respect. No more dismissing me. No more deciding where I fit in your life. If you want my help, you treat me like the mother I am, not some burden you can shove aside." There was silence, heavy and reluctant. Finally, he whispered, "I understand." But I wasn't finished. "And I want it in writing. If I even consider helping you, there will be no tricks, no backhanded deals. We meet with my lawyer. Everything goes through him. If you can't agree to that, then we have nothing to discuss." The shock in his silence was almost palpable. I could imagine his wife's fury, her nails digging into his arm, her whisper urging him to refuse. But eventually he exhaled and said, "Fine, we'll do it your way." When I hung up, I leaned back in my chair, my heart steady. For years I had felt like a guest in my own family, waiting for scraps of kindness. But now, I was no guest. I was the gatekeeper. The woman they thought powerless was the one holding every key, and I wasn't about to give them up easily. The following days revealed the true nature of my daughter-in-law. I had seen glimpses of it before her sly smiles, her cutting remarks, but now, with their plans slipping through their fingers, she dropped the mask entirely. It started small. Whispered rumors began to spread through the family. A cousin called me, saying, "I heard you're refusing to help your son. People are saying you've turned cold since your husband passed." The words stung, not because they were true, but because I knew exactly who had planted them. My daughter-in-law was weaving a story, painting me as selfish, as an old woman hoarding wealth while my own child suffered. I refused to take the bait. I told my cousin calmly, "Believe what you will. I know the truth." Then I hung up, my heart steady. The next attempt was more brazen. My son came by one evening without calling first. He stood on the porch with her right beside him, both of them shivering in the cold. "Mom," he began, "we can't keep doing this. We need to sit down and work something out." But before I could answer, she spoke up. "You're being unreasonable," she said sharply. "This house is too much for you. You don't need all of this space. We could sell it, pay off debts, start fresh. Everyone would benefit. Why are you clinging to it?" I stared at her through the glass door, my hand resting on the knob but not turning it. "Because it's mine," I said evenly. "And because your husband and I built our lives here. That's reason enough." Her face twisted, anger flashing in her eyes. My son tugged at her arm, muttering, "Not now," but the damage was done. I closed the curtain without another word. That night, I called my lawyer. He had been a close friend of my late husband and knew exactly what we had prepared for. I explained the situation, every call, every knock, every attempt at manipulation. He listened patiently before saying, "Don't worry. You're protected. Everything is in your name, and no court can force you to give it up. But it may be wise to gather documents, just in case they try to challenge you." His calm assurance gave me strength. The next morning, I dug out the fireproof box from my closet. Inside were the deeds, the bank statements, the will, all proof that I was the sole owner of everything. I placed them neatly in a folder, ready for the day they might be needed. My daughter-in-law didn't stop there. She began calling relatives, claiming I was mentally unwell, that I was being manipulated by outsiders. I heard about it when an old friend from church approached me gently, asking if I was feeling all right. I smiled, thanking her for her concern, but inside, I burned. They were trying to strip me of my credibility, hoping to paint me as unstable so they could swoop in and take control. But what they didn't know was that I had allies too. My neighbors had seen them pounding on my door, heard the sharpness in her voice. A few of them even stopped by to ask if I was all right. I reassured them, grateful for their quiet support. The more they pushed, the calmer I became. I realized that every desperate move they made only strengthened my position. Their lies revealed their fear. Their pressure revealed their weakness. One evening, I sat at my desk, my husband's photograph in front of me. "You were right," I whispered. "They thought I'd crumble, but I'm stronger than they know." I knew the next step would be a confrontation. She wouldn't stop with whispers or phone calls. She would try to force my hand, maybe even bring legal threats. But I wasn't afraid. I had the papers, the lawyer, the truth. And most of all, I had the determination not to let them erase me from my own life. This wasn't just about a house. It was about respect, dignity, and every wound they had inflicted with their careless words. They had made me feel small on Christmas Eve, but now they would see just how big my shadow could be. The war they wanted had begun, and I was ready. The confrontation came faster than I expected. One cold afternoon, I received a letter slipped through my mail slot. At first glance, it looked official. A legal notice on crisp paper. My son's name was on it, along with my daughter-in-law's. They were attempting to initiate a claim, suggesting I wasn't fit to manage the property, that I was withholding what should rightfully belong to the family. I laughed aloud, the sound echoing strangely in my quiet hallway. This was their grand strategy to paint me as incompetent, hoping a court would strip me of the home my husband entrusted to me. They underestimated me badly. The very next morning, I walked into my lawyer's office with the letter in hand. He skimmed it, shaking his head. "Empty threats," he said. "They have no grounds. But if it's a fight they want, we'll give them one." He made copies of all my documents, deed, will, bank accounts, and tucked them neatly into a thick file. "If this reaches a courtroom, you'll be untouchable." A week later, we arranged a family meeting at his office. I agreed because I wanted them to see, face to face, how wrong they were. My son sat across the table, pale and anxious, while his wife perched beside him, her jaw tight, her eyes flashing with restrained fury. My lawyer placed the folder on the desk with deliberate weight, the sound of it landing cutting through the tension like a gavel. "Before we begin," my lawyer said firmly, "let's make one thing clear. All property and financial assets in question are legally and solely in my client's name. There is no ambiguity here, no loophole, no technicality to exploit." He slid the deed across the table, letting them see the bold black letters of my name. My daughter-in-law snatched it up, scanning it furiously. Her lips pressed so tightly they turned white. My son's shoulders sagged, his eyes fixed on the floor. "You see," I said calmly, folding my hands on the table. "Your father trusted me to carry on after he was gone. He left everything to me, not to you, not to her. To me. And I will not dishonor that trust." My daughter-in-law finally spoke, her voice sharp and brittle. "This isn't fair. We're drowning in debt while you sit in that house alone. You don't need all of that. We do." I held her gaze. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? Fair would have been letting me sit at the Christmas table with my family. Fair would have been treating me like a human being, not a nuisance. You chose pride and greed over kindness. and now you're living with the consequences. My son tried to interject. Mom, please. But I stopped him with a raised hand. Number, I've listened long enough. This is my turn. I am not your problem to solve. And I will never again be your solution to debts you created. The room was silent except for the shuffle of papers. Finally, my lawyer gathered the documents back into the folder. Unless there is a legal basis to continue, he said firmly, this matter is closed. Any further harassment of my client will result in consequences. My daughter-in-law's face was flushed, her eyes glittering with rage she could no longer contain. She grabbed her coat and stormed out, muttering something under her breath. My son lingered, his eyes wet, his mouth opening as though to apologize, but no words came. He followed her out, the sound of the door closing behind them carrying more finality than any sentence could. I exhaled slowly, the tension draining from my body. For the first time, I felt not just secure, but victorious. They had tried to strip me of everything, my dignity, my home, my standing, and instead, I had shown them I was unshakable. That night, I sat in my living room with the lights of the tree still glowing softly. I picked up the glass star ornament, the one I hadn't hung that Christmas Eve, and placed it gently at the top of the tree. It wasn't for them. It wasn't even for my son. It was for me and for my husband, whose faith in me had carried me through. The war was over, and I had won. When I look back on that Christmas, the memory no longer stings the way it once did. The cold rejection at my son's doorstep, the loneliness of that silent holiday evening, it used to weigh heavily on me, like an open wound. Now, I see it for what it truly was, the turning point. The moment I chose to stop being small, to stop apologizing for existing, and to finally claim the strength my husband always believed I carried. 19 missed calls. 19 reminders that the ones who cast me aside suddenly realized how much they needed me. At first, it felt strange, almost surreal, to ignore them. But as the hours passed, I realized it wasn't cruelty, it was justice. For years, I had been the one to bend, to compromise, to accept less than I deserved, all in the name of family peace. That Christmas, their actions proved that peace had never been their goal, it was control. And I would no longer hand it to them. I've thought a lot about what family really means. It isn't just blood or shared last names. Family is built on respect, love, and a willingness to stand together even when life is messy. The ones who turned me away proved that to them, I was not family. I was a resource to be managed, a burden to be pushed aside until they needed me again. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. Since then, I've rebuilt my life in quiet but meaningful ways. I take long walks in the mornings, stopping by the park where children play and strangers greet me with warm smiles. I've joined a small group at church where we share meals and stories, and in their kindness, I've found the connection my own son denied me. My home, the one my husband and I built brick by brick, has become my sanctuary again, not a battleground. I've redecorated, filled it with flowers and photographs that make me smile. It no longer feels like something to defend. It feels like a place that belongs to me, completely and rightfully. As for my son, he hasn't stopped reaching out. The tone of his calls has changed, less demanding, more ashamed, sometimes even tender. I answer on my own terms. I don't slam doors, but I no longer open them wide just because he knocks. Forgiveness is possible, but forgetting is not. Trust, once broken, must be earned back one careful step at a time. And for his wife, well, she no longer dares to speak to me directly. Her silence says enough. If there's one lesson I've learned through it all, it's this. Silence can be powerful. That Christmas, my quiet refusal to answer those 19 calls said more than any angry words ever could. My silence showed them that I was not desperate for scraps of attention. It showed them that I had boundaries, dignity, and the strength to enforce both. They thought I would crumble. They thought that by excluding me, they could weaken me into submission. But all they did was reveal who they truly were and remind me who I truly am. I am not just a mother or a widow. I am a woman who has endured loss, betrayal, and loneliness, and still stands tall. I am the keeper of my husband's trust, the protector of the life we built together. And I am someone who knows, now more than ever, that my worth does not depend on anyone else's invitation. So when I think of those 19 missed calls, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel gratitude. Gratitude that I didn't answer too soon. Gratitude that I let silence speak for me. Gratitude that I finally realized my strength. They thought I was powerless. But in the end, I smiled, with 19 missed calls lighting up my screen. And to you, listening to my story, I want to ask, what would you have done? Would you have answered? Forgiven? Forgotten? Or would you have held your silence like I did, letting it become your sweetest revenge? Tell me what you think, because sometimes the greatest lessons come not from the people who love us, but from those who teach us how strong we can be when they don't.